I look forward to just spending some time with you here, sharing some research that's called the Flourishing in Ministry Project. And I always need to say at the outset, when I share this in this kind of context, that I'm indebted to Dr. Matt Bloom, who created this project originally at University of Notre Dame. And Dr. Bloom had studied well-being, but in a particular kind of way, so human flourishing, well-being at work, in helping professions more broadly, with the thought that if we can study folks that are immersed in the human condition every day in one way or another, physicians, social workers, teachers, therapists, clergy, etc., relief and development workers, they're immersed in human suffering and helping others, and yet themselves seem to be flourishing. How are they doing that? What are the factors and conditions and practices that sustain that? And Matt's wife, Kim, is a longtime pastor, and so he lived life as a clergy spouse and decided to focus on clergy as well. And so this research has been going on for coming up on 15 years now, I think. And we've got somewhere north of, I think it's 20,000 plus clergy in the database and growing. It's been both qualitative and quantitative for those researchers on the call. And so I want to share with you some highlights for a bit here, and then we certainly can have time for some conversation, which would be delightful, this group. So let me share my slides here. Okay. So we know from previous research what leads to some of the negative outcomes, stress, exhaustion, and particularly in this season right now, post-COVID, and as we come up on another presidential election season in the US, just the emotional exhaustion of clergy is really pronounced. We know that ministry leadership places demands and stresses on a marriage and family, really unlike any other role. And we'll talk a little bit about burnout and what we know about depression among clergy as well. So we know a lot of the things that lead to that, and quite a bit about how to prevent that. But we're also learning more about what not only prevents the difficult stuff, but what promotes the flourishing life, the kind of life into which Christian pastors are inviting other people. We know that well-being ebbs and flows. Not a huge insight there. Not every day is a great day in life, and that's not even promised to us in Scripture. Not every day is a great day in ministry. We originally set out to look at the typical rhythm of sort of your average North American clergy person. And what won't be surprising to many of you who are pastors or are familiar with pastors is that there was no typical rhythm that we could find. The job is inherently unpredictable. And so knowing that, there are some implications we can think about that to help ourselves, those of us in ministry leadership, be more intentional about boosting our well-being in particular areas. And we now know from huge body of global research in human flourishing and positive psychology, the practices that help to boost our well-being in different areas. And as you all know, many of those, if not most of them, that are being researched are ancient Christian spiritual practices. And so what we're doing in some ways is strategically recapturing some of the rich resources within our own tradition and helping clergy think about their own rhythm. So the thing that I want to emphasize is that in my experience clinically, as well as my experience in pastoral roles myself, and I'm a pastor's kid, third generation PK, that the ebb and flow is often something that is outside of our awareness because ministry leaders are so busy getting onto the next urgent thing, because there's always a next urgent thing, that we don't often take time to step back from the busyness, step back from the flow, and just be mindful in a Christian mindfulness kind of way of what we're carrying emotionally, where we're holding stress in our body, those kinds of things. And so we'll talk a little bit about those skills. And because those things are out of our awareness, they can accumulate over time, and they can accumulate either positively or negatively. And what can happen is that accumulation, that negative accumulation, can get to a critical threshold where it forces us to be aware of it all of a sudden because it's been building for a long time. And that often is a painful season to be in. It's when we have phone calls about clergy that are in crisis in one way or another. But the good news is it can also accumulate positively, which you all know, and it's small steps done frequently and consistently that over time can build in a positive direction. The research literature talks about broadening and building, and so the metaphor I use for that positive spiral is like a spiral staircase that gets broader in circumference the further up you go. And so what we want to talk about is how do we help ourselves, help ministry leaders intentionally put themselves into a positive spiral like that. We also know that well-being happens in an ecosystem, and that's true for everyone, but there's some unique concerns here when it comes to ministry leaders because of what's called role immersion, being immersed in a role 24/7. There just is no other role quite like being a pastor with respect to the 24/7 demands, the way people relate to your role. And so I've moved away, and Dr. Bloom and I have had conversations about this, moved away from exclusively using self-care language for ministry leaders because that can unintentionally imply that, Pastor, here's one more thing that you're not doing well that you need to add to your to-do list, taking care of yourself. And I've also seen it weaponized against pastors by church boards or other leadership. The reason this church isn't growing, pastor, is because you're not taking care of yourself, and it's a blame kind of weapon, and that's not at all what we're trying to imply. We all probably do need to take better care of ourselves in some respect, but that's not all that needs to happen. We also need to look at the ecosystem and the environment, the work environment in which a clergy person is living 24/7, or at least almost all the time. And what are the conditions and practices there? And so there are lots of implications for organizational health, congregational health as well, of our research that we want to pay attention to also. So after almost 15 years of research and refining model, this is our model of flourishing in ministry, these 5 dimensions: daily well-being, resilience, thriving, authenticity, and then the 5th dimension is the social ecosystem that surrounds all of that. And we know that these are interrelated, such that the more daily well-being we experience, the more resilient we become and thrive more and experience deeper, richer authenticity, which leads to even greater daily well-being and even more resilience and so forth. We also know that the opposite is true. And the first thing to get low for ministry leaders is daily well-being. Just that sense of having a decent day, not necessarily the greatest day in your life, but feeling pretty good emotionally, physically, relationally, spiritually, vocationally. And if that gets too low for too long, which it often does because of the chronic stress that pastors live in, then it starts to pull down the other dimensions as well. So that's where I want to start, and I'll just touch base on highlights of these dimensions, and then we can have some time for some questions. So daily well-being, this is where we talk about emotional and physical well-being, quality of daily life. What's the impact of stress? Stress, of course, is unavoidable in life, and a certain amount of stress actually helps us to rise to the challenge and bring our best to our work and to life. But it's the chronic stress, chronic high stress, that really becomes challenging. And the question here is one of dominant tone. And many of you who research and read in this area know that the research talks about happiness and how we need to experience these kinds of emotions and these kinds of experiences more often than negative ones overall to have a sense of happiness and well-being, feeling calm, gratitude, experiences of awe and worship, for example, joy, those things. And the question really here is of dominant tone over time, over, say, 6 months to a year or more. This isn't every moment of every day. I'm not suggesting that. That's not realistic, nor is that biblical, in my opinion. But on the whole, do we have more positive experiences than negative, such that we develop a sustained positivity that I think is rooted in eschatology in some ways, the hope of the gospel. We can draw upon that. And the prophet Nehemiah reminds us that the joy of the Lord is our strength. In other words, there's joy within the inner life of God that we're invited to access and participate in and draw strength from that in a sustained positivity kind of way. If these kinds of things become dominant, then that's just something to pay attention to with respect to well-being, and depression, burnout, those kinds of things. Now, we all experience some of these kinds of things every day. That's part of life and human condition. But if these things become dominant over time, more than the positive kinds of lists that we just looked at, then that's really something to pay attention to. One of my mentors in my life was Dr. Archibald Hart. Some of you may be familiar with that name. He was one of the first people to study ministry stress, really starting back in the 70s. And my favorite quote of his is this one: pastors don't get into trouble because they forget that they're pastors. That's not the issue for us. When are you not a pastor, for those of you on the call that are in ministry leadership? It's a 24/7 role immersion kind of experience. We don't get into trouble because we forget that we're pastors. We get into trouble because we forget that we're persons. And so I want to give you permission to give yourself permission to be a person and be human, and embrace the limitations that come with that can ultimately be freeing. And then to participate with how God has designed us and the kinds of practices that God has given us throughout church history to flourish. Here's what we know about the health of clergy. Clergy are at high risk for and have a high rate of what's called metabolic syndrome. And what is metabolic syndrome? If you have three of these five things: high blood pressure, high triglycerides, which is the bad cholesterol, low HDL, which is the good cholesterol. It should be at a certain level or higher, and often comes up with exercise, and often is also a stronger risk factor for heart attack than even high bad cholesterol. High fasting blood sugar, which of course can lead to diabetic kinds of conditions. And a large abdominal circumference, meaning moving into clinical obesity the way a physician would diagnose that. Why does that matter? It matters because metabolic syndrome puts a person at exponentially higher risk for cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, diabetes, arthritis, a bunch of bad stuff that can certainly impair our capacity to be effective in ministry, but even cut short a person's life. My grandfather, who was a pastor, the second half of his adult life, died young of a heart attack, and I'm convinced that a lot of that had to do with ministry stress and lack of self-care. Nobody was talking about this kind of stuff back in the years that he was leading small, sometimes what I would call clergy killing congregations in New England for a lot of his ministry life. And it took a toll. And so in some ways, what we're talking about here is stewardship of the greatest tool God has given you for ministry, which is you. And how do we flourish? How do we lean into the kinds of rhythms for which we're created, such that we can be as effective for as long as possible for the sake of God's kingdom work? I also want to touch on depression just briefly. The research that exists that's well done on depression among clergy suggests that the rate of clinical depression among clergy is a couple percentage points higher probably than the general population of the United States. And that's what the numbers look like pre-COVID, by the way. Stay tuned for the post-COVID analysis. And then the rate of depression of clergy spouses is probably a couple percentage points higher than that of clergy, which is higher than that of the general population. And I say that just to normalize depression in ministry for leaders, because so often, and I've heard people share this with me in coaching conversations or psychotherapy conversations, ministry leaders who are experiencing depression, largely induced by the work of ministry, and there are lots of psychological reasons for that. There are also reasons related to the physiology of stress and how that plays out in our brain and our body over time. And so the inner narrative of pastors can be something like this. I should not be feeling this way. I am an ordained pastor. I've been doing this for 30 years. This means I'm a failure in some way as a spiritual leader. I should not be feeling depressed. So we will sometimes quietly, internally beat ourselves up for feeling depressed, which of course doesn't help and can even exacerbate the depression, as opposed to exercising self-compassion, which is what ministry leaders do for literally everyone else in their life all the time. One of my favorite questions to ask pastors that I'm working with individually is what would you say to you if you came to you for pastoral care? And it helps us to remember to put ourselves on our pastoral care list. I also just want to mention that there appears to be a gender difference in the experience of depression. We have to be careful, of course, not to overgeneralize with gender, but generally speaking, the way we've historically diagnosed depression may be more of a female experience of it, in the sense that women often are more subjectively aware of feeling depressed, sad mood, anhedonia, without pleasure, not enjoying things that they would typically enjoy, etc. And men, depending on how they're socialized growing up, and certainly cultural differences are a big factor here as well, can be trained from early in life that, boys don't cry, men are tough. And so the message is sort of cut yourself off from your internal world. And so it's possible for a man to be depressed and not actually be aware of it, but it's expressing itself in behavior, addiction, addictive behavior, anger issues, that sort of thing. And the same can be true of clergy, of course, as human beings. So the good news is those numbers don't have to be that way. And we think what's happening is the chronically elevated stress physiology of clergy, without self-care, without taking time for enough sleep, enough exercise, enough rest from ministry work, and paying attention to healthy nutrition, combined with that role immersion and 24/7 overtaxing our stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. There are a bunch of them, and if they're chronically elevated, and then we don't take care of ourselves, then that leads to metabolic syndrome, depression, and burnout, and study after study after study. But we can do something about it. And so contemplative spiritual practices seem to be particularly important for ministry leaders. Not that other spiritual practices are unimportant, but these seem to be particularly important. So things like centering prayer, silence, solitude, breath prayer, Ignatian spiritual exercises, practicing Sabbath in the full, robust sense of what that means biblically, as a time to detach from work and to engage with other things that are restorative, that remind us of who we are as children of God. And we're not defined by our productivity. We're not defined by the economic system in which we live. And there's an awful lot we can unpack with Sabbath practices. And we think in part those seem to be particularly important because they're about just being with God, listening to God, receiving from God, and sort of stepping outside of having to religiously perform, which is what clergy have to do all the time, and to just be and experience communion with God. Holy detachment, we need to play, to do something for at least 30 minutes a week that meets these three criteria, that you enjoy doing just for the sheer enjoyment of the activity. You can literally lose yourself in it like a child at play, and it's something that evokes all kinds of positive emotions and fun. That you have some skill in doing. It can be developing skill, but you at least have some sense of mastery. That's what psychologists would call it. And then the really important one is that it takes your full attention to do it. The reason that's important is because sometimes when pastors take a physical break from ministry to take time off or their day off or their Sabbath, they're also still working up here in their head. The sermon is still percolating. You're dreading a board meeting coming up, or you're worried about a parishioner who's in the hospital or what have you. And so even when we're supposed to be resting, taking time off, we're still stirring up all that stress physiology because we're mentally working. And so to take a physical and mental break from ministry activity is a really important practice and is very restorative. Taking care of our bodies, getting enough sleep, 7 to 9 hours a night is what the experts tell us we need on average. And any of you or clergy who are struggling with fatigue, with just feeling exhausted and some symptoms of depression or anxiety, the first thing to triage is sleep and make sure that they're actually getting good sleep. And there's so much wonderful technology now with sleep specialists and sleep studies. Lots of things we can do to help people get good sleep. And that's just more and more research coming out all the time about the importance of good sleep. Paying attention to exercise and healthy nutrition, again, basic things that we know we're supposed to do, but the reasons we don't do those things get more complicated, especially for clergy. And embracing our limits, having good boundaries around time management, and managing our adrenaline. Ministry is an adrenaline demanding profession, and this is what I see is often off the radar for clergy. And we can have more conscious choice over our adrenaline than we think that we can, just by being mindful. So in the middle of a stressful situation, to just pause and step back from the situation and do what's called a cognitive appraisal of that situation. What's important here? What's at stake for me here? What's getting triggered or stirred up in me? And to think that through, and then think through the pastoral response versus just a knee-jerk reaction. And just slowing down and taking ourselves through our own method of that has been demonstrated in many studies to reduce blood pressure, reduce cholesterol, reduce stress-related kinds of things, just by pausing, taking a step back and getting some perspective. And so we know that that's a really important stress management tool as well. All right, so let's move on to resilience, which is about being able to go through difficult things and cope and bounce back and adapt. This is also where we talk about ministry burnout. We asked clergy in this study, again, pre-COVID, not only what are the things that help you form and sustain what we're calling a positive pastoral identity, which is to say a positive sense of myself in a very complex, demanding role that endures over time. And there are many, many things that they said to us about what fosters that, but we also asked what hinders that, what makes it difficult to sustain that positive pastoral identity. And there were many, many things they said to us. These were the top 4 themes. Complaints from parishioners, which I'm sure is not a surprise to any of you on the call who have ever been in a pastoral role. Negative challenges from lay members. This means challenging your pastoral identity in a global sense, that you're a pastor sort of in totality for some reason. And what we find is that female clergy and pastors of color, depending on their context, are more often on the receiving end of these kinds of comments that are globally devaluing, that may in fact actually be sexism, racism, and that just, of course, gets really challenging. It's really old to be on the receiving end of those kinds of comments. Churches that demand the pastor conform to their expectations, which I suppose on some level is every church, but this is talking about when it's really excessive, when there isn't sort of a appropriate deference to pastoral leadership. Not that there isn't accountability. Of course, there should be accountability for leaders. There should even be healthy conflict, in my opinion. But the single strongest predictor of flourishing for clergy that we found so far is a positive relationship that's mutually supportive and respectful between pastoral leadership and congregation. And we're in a season, at least in North America, when so many pastors are feeling treated with contempt from people that they have sacrificed for and been there for. And there's a level of, I think, even relational trauma and a resulting post-traumatic stress that results from that relational trauma, just from the kinds of vitriolic conflict that happen in churches that seems to be at an all-time high in our current polarized kind of cultural context in North America. And that's what leads to isolation, which is what comes up again and again and again in the clergy stress literature, really for decades now. And it's kind of paradoxical. It's sort of the water every to drink kind of phenomenon that pastors are around people all the time. And so how is it possible that they might be isolated? Well, I think it's because people are relating more to your role and what they psychologically project onto your role than to actually who you are as a person or as a leader. And so we need to have places in our lives that know us, that are truly mutually reciprocal, where we can just be a person in order to sustain us in all these other challenging interactions. This is where we talk about burnout, because the chronic interpersonal stress that includes what in the occupational stress research is called emotional labor is what can lead to burnout, which includes these kinds of things: exhaustion. The emotional exhaustion's probably the most prevalent, but even physically and mentally, just feeling like I got nothing left. I want to have something left. I feel like I should have something left, but I am just spent. And people find that they can't kind of roll with the inevitable punches, so to speak, or curveballs that come with life and ministry, and feel competent to do that. And at some point, we can feel despondent and cynical. Why does it matter? Why even try? What's the point? And certainly I hear more of that during and after COVID from clergy than I think I remember hearing prior to that, as we try to figure out what does church look like post-COVID, and not everybody's coming back to church. And I thought we were further along in our Christian maturity as a congregation than apparently we are, based on how people are behaving in social media when they disagree with one another, and all the kinds of things that pastors are dealing with now in a more dramatic kind of way. And so here's what I really want you to hear about ministry burnout, is that it sneaks up on people. Pre-COVID, we thought that with some confidence that around a third, 30 or so % of clergy were in moderate to severe burnout at any given time. And probably most pastors and other helping professionals dip in and out of it, at least mild burnout from time to time over the course of a career, just due to the nature of the work itself. But the thing that has been a consistent finding for us across many, many, many pastors is that it sneaks up on leaders. Pastor has said to us, it hit me out of nowhere. It blindsided me. I didn't see it. Well, the truth is, it had been building through the mild and moderate stages outside of our awareness. Again, it's that accumulation. And then it hits a threshold of severity, and boom, leaders are aware of it all of a sudden. And at that point, it's costly. And so that begs a couple of questions. One is for leaders: who in our lives knows us well enough and loves us enough to point out the early warning signs of burnout in us, what those look like uniquely in us, so that we can take action early to stop the slide into moderate or severe burnout? And what are the loving accountability structures around us that encourage us to pay attention to a rule of life, which is a concept from church history, from Benedictine spirituality, a set of rhythms and practices that help us sustain flourishing in the midst of all the complexity and stress. And then how do we prevent it? How do we prevent burnout? And what we're finding is that the cultivation of self-regulatory capacities, these three in particular, help us to prevent burnout and promote resilience and flourishing. Self-awareness. Can't say enough about developing self-awareness as a ministry leader. The basic idea here is, what am I doing, thinking, and feeling? And what impact is that having on me and other people? What am I doing, thinking, feeling? What impact is that having on me and other people? The self-reflection is, why am I doing, thinking, and feeling what I'm doing, thinking, and feeling? Where's that coming from? It might be just the nature of the situation and the other people involved. It also might be that something about this particular ministry scenario has activated or triggered something in my own story, in my own psychological makeup, that I need to be able to self-regulate so that I don't act in a way that's harmful out of a knee-jerk reaction, but respond in a way that is pastoral. And that's the self-control piece, which of course we're created for as a fruit of the Spirit, as Christians, as believers, that based on my self-awareness and self-reflection, I can then exercise self-control and choose the response that makes the most sense. And what the research clearly shows is that we can all grow in these competencies. We all start off maybe at a different point based on our personality, our family of origin formation, our stage in life, lots of different factors. But we can all grow. And there are lots of ways we can do this. This is not an exhaustive list, and I won't go over all of these for the sake of time. And I will make these slides available, by the way, Dr. Accountant, so you can send these out to participants. But I want to focus on a couple in particular here under self-reflection, acknowledging hidden losses. Especially over the last year and a half, I find myself talking with clergy a lot about the practice of lament, which of course is a deeply biblical, deeply Christian practice. But there are lots of ambiguous, hidden, and what I might call disenfranchised losses in ministry leadership, meaning nobody acknowledges them or seems to care about them. And sometimes we can not even acknowledge them ourselves. And we can't grieve things that we haven't named. And so it's important to name those losses, help ourselves with the bereavement part, which is what you do for everybody else all the time as a pastor. And there are ways we can do that. And there's a biblical model for that, of course, in the Psalms, Lamentations, many places we could go to look at how do we help ourselves bring that loss and grief to God and process that well. And then I also do a lot of work, have for years, doing psychological evaluations of clergy candidates for denominations that require that as part of the ordination process, which I think is a good thing. And the three most common recommendations I've made over the years are the three at the bottom there, that developing anger management competencies, conflict resolution skills, and assertiveness training. Many of us, if not most of us, that go into ministry leadership are nice people, and we can tend to be more on the passive side of things, even conflict avoidant, which can often lead to more and worse conflict than if we were to address it early on. And so to develop more assertiveness, which is not being aggressive, it's not about being a bully or coercive or manipulative or using power in unethical kinds of ways in a ministry role. But it's also not being passive or passive aggressive either. There's a middle place to giving voice to my needs, wants, what I think, those kinds of things. That is a competency that's very important for healthy ministry leadership. All right, let's talk about thriving. This is about connectedness to meaning and purpose in life, connectedness to God and to other people. And what we find is that pastors, as a general rule, have a high sense of meaning and purpose in life. We get to live out our deepest convictions in our work, and not everybody gets to do that in their workplace in the same way. And of course, pastors go through times of spiritual dryness and feeling like God is distant or silent or dark night of the soul kinds of experiences. But generally speaking, feel a strong sense of connection to God. It's the connection to other people that seems to be the most challenging, which again is confusing to people who've never been in ministry leadership. But there are a lot of relationships that a pastor engages in that are kind of one-way intimacy. People are sharing, their deepest, darkest things with you, and you're not necessarily sharing those your own stuff with parishioners, nor should you necessarily. But what we want to suggest is you need to share that somewhere. And what Dr. Bloom uses, and I like this metaphor, is the metaphor of a stage that we need three kinds of relationships to flourish. Front stage relationships that are mutually supportive, people that are sharing the public role of ministry on the front stage with you. Backstage, what happens on the backstage? We rehearse for the front stage. We go over the technical kinds of things. This is all the behind the scenes stuff. And the one that we find that clergy really need to pay attention to is having a community of practice. Other people that do what you do, that you can regularly get together with, just to be vulnerable, be accountable, because you don't have to explain to others who are also in pastoral leadership what it's like. You just know. And it's really helpful to break that sense of isolation, to share share reality, share perspective with people that are in the trenches also and get it. And they all need an offstage. With whom and where and when can you just be a person and truly have reciprocal, healthy intimacy? Certainly in a marriage and family, if that's healthy, that's the case. But I also always recommend having at least one close personal friendship outside of your ministry context. Why? Because that person's not in the emotional ecosystem that you're in most of the time. They know you're a pastor, believe in that, support you in that, but you don't have to be their pastor. You can just be you. You can just be a friend. And all that means, to be fully spontaneously yourself. And that's a really important practice as well. And then finally, authenticity. What we found leads to long-term flourishing is developing what we call a quiet self, meaning a person who has cultivated true biblical humility in the sense that they know their strengths, and they're aware of those and know how to strategically leverage those for the good of the church and kingdom work, but also aware of vulnerabilities and take proactive steps to put people around them with complementary strengths, and just lean into that I accept myself with both my strengths and my growth areas, and I'm going to live out of that place of self-awareness and self-acceptance in an important kind of way. I'm going to skip ahead here for the second time. Now, what makes this difficult is role complexity. A friend of mine who's a phenomenal researcher, Dr. Rick Deshawn, did a job analysis of clergy a number of years ago. It's where you do a systematic analysis of the kinds of tasks that a particular profession has to do, hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, and then what are the core competencies a person would need in order to do that job well. And he came back to us and said, I'm baffled. I've never seen a job this complex with this breadth of areas of competency. It would be nice to be an expert in. And then what are called switching costs, switching rapidly between those competencies in any given day. Who would ever try this, was his comment. This is a setup to feel inadequate. And that piqued my interest as a clinician. I certainly felt that as a pastor, but also seen that so many times that it's just an impossible job description in some ways, because it calls for people to be an expert generalist, when the truth is we're all expert specialists in the sense that we have gifts and strengths in particular areas. We've got education and training in some areas. So maybe 2/3 or so of these competencies, we might have at least threshold competencies, meaning good enough competencies. And then we'll be really strong in certain areas. And then other areas we're not going to be as strong. And so what we know from the positive psych research is that we can put time and energy into getting better at what we're not very good at, and you will get improvement. You'll get incremental growth bit by bit. You'll get better. But if you took a lot of that same time and energy and invested it in developing strengths, you get exponential growth. And then you can leverage that growth to address other areas. And so it kind of flips around what we typically do. And so I want to give you permission to lead out of your strengths, your capabilities, your personality characteristics, and what's most important to you in your own personal theology and values, and to lead and live out of those. At least 60% of the time is the threshold. Over the course of, say, a year or more, as you manage your time and energy and job description, what are you going to emphasize? And also think about the goodness of fit for a particular leader with a particular ministry context. That's often not thought about at all the levels that are important, and before a pastor is appointed or accepts a position. And then a couple of years into that assignment, there starts to be an awareness that pastoral staff and congregation are on very different pages about what we're doing here with respect to the nature and mission of the church, and conflict ensues that maybe could have been avoided or clarified on the front end. So thinking about the goodness of fit, the particular leader, particular set of strengths, and what's needed in leadership in a particular context based on all kinds of factors, and kind of doing good premarital counseling, as it were, in that placement process of clergy, we're finding is a bigger deal than we even thought it was going to be at the beginning of this research. And so what are the ways that we can help ourselves in authenticity, cultivating self-acceptance, living and leading out of our strengths at least 60% of the time on average over time. And I'll just share this other one, which was really intriguing to me when we first sort of discovered this was important. And I've had pastors call me, email me, who've been through our Flourishing in Ministry coach training or work with one of our Flourishing Ministry coaches, to say this practice is a game changer. Just to go back to something that brings you the most joy in ministry at the end of the workday, which typically is not 5 p.m. for most pastors. It may be 1 a.m. or something. But to go back to one of those things that brings you the most joy in ministry for at least 15-20 minutes at the end of the workday. Now, that's not going to take away the bad day when you had to spend all day totally outside of your sweet spots or totally outside of anything you ever thought you'd have to do as a ministry leader. But doing that every day, day in and day out, we're finding makes an enormous difference toward preventing burnout, promoting authenticity and flourishing, just to touch with the joy of ministry as the last thing you do for the day, for your work day. So that's our model. And we have also divided the research on positive psych practices into categories that map onto those dimensions. And we'll have a re-release of our Flourishing Ministry app in the next couple of months. That's a self-help tool that will give pastors a personalized profile on their own flourishing, and the implications for strategies in these different categories of what can be helpful to intentionally practice. And again, the good news is small steps done frequently and consistently and done in community really do make a huge difference over time. And so our website's flourishinginministry.org if you are interested in more information. And I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So thanks for staying engaged. I know that was a lot.